Hello and welcome to this episode of Superhero Ethics. Today we are continuing our conversation with Jessica Plummer about the history of the Silver Age of comics. All that and more after this commercial break we have no control over. Welcome back. I'm Matthew. I'm joined again by our host, Jessica Plummer. Jessica, obviously the Silver Age has a lot to talk about because we're now on our second episode about it.
I love the Silver Age. I could talk about it for ages.
Awesome. I was teasing you a little bit before about how when you were first telling me what we were talking about, it was, well, we're mostly going to talk about Marvel and we might touch on DC. And then, you went straight to the DC stuff because there's so much there to talk about too.
I love them.
I think it's great. I think it's, I have much more of a Marvel background. You have much more of a DC background. But part of what I'm really enjoying about this process is seeing how much those two, they're separate in some places, they're overlapping in some places, and really that they're both kind of feeding into each other in how they're shaping this comics history we're talking about.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, like I always say, it's the same people going back and forth between the two companies, and they're looking at what's working for each other, and they're copying those ideas, and we're all the better for it.
Right. And that's actually I want to dive. We were in the middle of talking about the Marvel effect of the 60s, and we'll get back to that in a second. But I want to start with kind of a broader question. I don't know how much you know about sort of the sociology of comics fans at this time, but maybe you can make it up and we'll all believe you because you probably know more than any of us. At this point, would most kids who read comic books happily, go to the newsstand and buy a copy of Fantastic Four while also buying Superman? Or would you have the group of kids who love DC and they're teasing their friends because they love Marvel and Batman's better or Captain America's better?
I'm not totally sure, but I think this is really where readers start to pull away into those brands, into that brand loyalty, and that is very much a Marvel thing. It is something that Stan Lee, last time we were talking about how Stan Lee was a showman and a self-aggrandizer, and it was absolutely true to Stan Lee's benefit, but it was also very, very true to Marvel's benefit. And I say this with immense love, but he made Marvel into a cohesive brand with a certain, there was a very holistic way of addressing the reader. So If you read these comics, there's the narration boxes talk directly to the reader. They refer to the Marvel creators and employees with fun nicknames like Stan the Man or Smilin' Stan and King Kirby and all the just ridiculous names. Right. Some of them are very Jazzy Johnny for John Romita Sr. They're very stupid names. But they'll have comics that take place inside the bullpen, so you can get to know the staffers.
Oh, that's fantastic.
Yeah, and they refer to the Marvel Age of comics. They refer to DC as both the distinguished competition, but it's kind of snide, and brand but it's kind of loving.
Yeah.
And it's very much are you going to read Marvel comics or are you going to read brand
Yeah.
But in an affectionate, playful, competitive way. Right. Stan Lee would address Marvel fans as true believers. And so it becomes very much a part of your identity to be a Marvel reader. And that was something that was deliberately cultivated by Stan and by Marvel. So whether that was a thing that was already naturally happening, I don't know. Right. But I would venture to say that it increased very much at this time.
I have to imagine you had an awful lot of households where the father and maybe even the mother who had grown up reading Superman and Wonder Woman and Batman and were now tearing their hair out, that their kids are like, that's company, I want to, read about the Fantastic Four or X-Men. I'm
sure there were familial battles or the younger sibling is reading Superman and the older sibling is like, that's for kids. I'm reading Spider-Man.
Right, of course, the cool one. And so let's talk about, we talked a lot about the Marvel method and Lee and Kirby. Let's talk about the specific comics we're talking about. Obviously, the Fantastic Four, they're the ones that started all out. Take us down the list, and let's talk for a minute about some of the other major names that are now obviously a huge part of our culture today. The ones that get released during this time, some of which to big fanfare, some of which are, surprisingly, maybe given how big they are today, pretty small potatoes even back then.
Yeah, so between like 61 and 66, we see Marvel is just like slamming them out. Like all these major characters, all these characters have been in movies. Most of them have been in a whole bunch of movies that made billions of dollars now. So the biggest ones at the time, like the ones that were basically the ones that were important before the MCU was a thing. We get the Fantastic Four in 61. In 62, we get the Hulk and Thor, which are both by Lee and Kirby. And we get Spider-Man, who's created by Stan Lee and Steve Ditko. In 63, we get the Avengers. So the characters had all already existed. The original lineup is Ant-Man, the Wasp, Iron Man, Thor, and the Hulk. They're just brought together for the first time in the Avengers #1, which is by Lee and Kirby. And they bring Captain America back from nobody knew what had happened to Captain America. They just stopped publishing him. But in Avengers #4, they're like, oh, he was frozen in the ice, but he's back now. Here he is.
Well, and I want to ask you about this team-up thing, but first, we mentioned Iron Man, so I want to let you put to bed a myth that I think is still held by many people. The character of Iron Man and the song Iron Man. There's no connection between these two at all, right?
Not that I know of.
Yeah.
I don't think so.
From what I've read, both of the music history and the comics history, is that the two are not really connected, and that it's pretty clear that Ozzy Osbourne and Black Sabbath did not even know about the character when they wrote the song.
No. So 63 gives us the Avengers, and speaking of teams, it also gives us the X-Men, the original lineup of the X-Men. And those are sort of the very big names that really sort of changed the face of comics at the time. But we also have a number of other really characters who are now household names. Iron Man, as I mentioned, is one of them. He shows up in 63. He's another Lee and Kirby creation. We get Ant-Man in 62, and the Wasp shows up as a supporting character for him in 63. Lee and Kirby again. Mm-hmm. Doctor Strange in 63. That's Lee and Ditko. Iron Man. Did I say Iron Man?
Yeah.
Oh, well, Iron Man. So he's thought of as like a very prominent character now, but that's mostly because of the movies. He was like a B or C lister before. You're gonna get letters about that one.
Oh well, no, but I think it's very
C list, not C. Sorry.
I think that's actually something I think is very well understood, and I've actually seen a lot of great writing about this idea that part of what has made the MCU successful, is the fact that for many people this was their first introduction to those characters. You know, like any Batman I see is competing with me for my 6-year-old memory of Michael Keaton, or my 9-year-old memory of Michael Keaton. I'm bad at math. Whereas like Thor, Captain America, it's their first appearance for many people. But the other thing is that my understanding is that a lot of the MCU came about because the bigger names had all been sold off. You know, Fantastic Four had been sold to another company so they could make movies with it. Spider-Man had been. Fantastic Four done so badly. Like it at first surprised me when I realized that the Fantastic Four is considered the most famous of the Marvel comics originally, because it's the one that, at least in this modern era, has done so badly on screen compared to everything else. But then it actually makes sense, is that was the one that people would be most wanting to make movies of 20 years ago. And so other people would have the rights in the way that who'd want to buy the rights to Iron Man or Thor 20 years ago.
Yeah, exactly. They sold off Spider-Man, they sold off Fantastic Four, they sold off the X-Men, which is a huge property because it encompasses anybody who is a mutant. And that's why they had to go to the second string for their movies, and it worked really well because, like you said, nobody had that
childhood
preset
memory to compete with.
Right, they didn't have that childhood memory, and they didn't even have like, well, I guess that mainly it's other multimedia appearances, but even really well-known comics to reference. Like they were blank slates. There's a couple of other or a few other characters from this era. We get Black Widow as an Iron Man villain, actually, in '64. We get Daredevil, who was created by Stan Lee and Bill Everett in '64 as well. And we get Black Panther showing up in an issue of Fantastic Four in 1966, and he was not a major character at the time. Like he's a supporting character in this issue of Fantastic Four, but of course he is obviously extremely financially successful now. But B, he was the first black superhero in mainstream American comics.
Right.
Marvel would not get another one until The Falcon in 1969, and DC would not have one until John Stewart, who is a Green Lantern character, in 1971.
Right. So, and there's a bunch of things that you've dropped that I want to talk about, but let's dive into Black Panther. So, how important was it when that came out? Was it a lot of controversy? Was it something that was kind of a risk for Marvel to do?
Honestly, I'm not sure. I know that it was important to Lee and Kirby to tell stories about social justice and to include a certain amount of diversity, that, with the large grain of salt that they were white men of their time.
Right.
And they were working from that place of relative privilege, despite being Jewish in the 40s and and the decades after, obviously, and despite coming from working class backgrounds. But I think it was also, it was new and it was shocking, but it was also, to a certain extent, very much in keeping with earlier stories and pulp stories of characters, finding magical lands in exotic locales. Wakanda is Shangri-La. It's all of these mysterious places with locals who have secret technology and magic and powers. It was just that Wakanda and the Black Panther and T'Challa are treated with dignity in this story, and he is treated right from the start as an equal and a fellow hero, which is not to say, there is some language in that comic that it's no good. It's no good.
Yeah, I think the way you put it about sort of, this is white men trying to write black liberation, with both all of the good intentions and the problems that can lead to. And Black Panther is a character I've studied quite a bit because I've been very fascinated by it. One thing I think is, here I think especially it's helpful to sort of put Black Panther's origins into the cultural milieu that we're talking about, in that, it's the height of civil rights, or civil rights is starting to merge into, anti-poverty and the anti-Vietnam struggle and things like that. But still, the divides over civil rights are very big and a very important thing. And writing a character about a strong black character who lives in a, powerful black-run world is that's an inherently incredible political statement. But at the same time, also, it's not, I'm trying to kind of best say this, it doesn't feel like it's groundbreaking in terms of media in general, because this is the time we're starting to see that all over the place. Star Trek is putting a black character into space, and media and movies are doing a lot more with this. Not that this is a perfect work of historical sociology, but Hairspray, which is a favorite movie and musical of mine, a big joke about that is that to the young, if you're a hip teenager, then black music and black culture are the cool things. And there's obviously a huge amount of problems with that. But to me, that's a kind of nice reminder of this is a period in time when bringing in like the black character on the show, the black comic book hero, whatever it is, that's something that like a part of the culture is definitely moving to, even though another large part of it is very against it.
Yeah, and it's also, I mean, it's important to note too that while it's so crucial that this character was introduced and that this barrier was broken, he's there for this issue. He's not a recurring member of the cast. They go back to New York. He's still in Wakanda, and he shows up occasionally. Right. And eventually, years later, he would become an Avenger and obviously like get his own comic much later and move up to a more prominent status within the Marvel Universe. But at first, it's just, here's this story about this guy, right. Which is very much how, for example, DC's introduction of Jon Stewart is very much like, here's this story about this guy. The white characters learned a valuable lesson about racism. Let's go back to what we were doing. Yeah,
like I know a lot of the Black Panther character really only takes off, unfortunately, during the blaxploitation era, when there's a lot of sort of like there's a whole cultural history behind that it's very much not in my lane, but it's another important thing to remember. Is that kind of how intentional is that? Like, do you think there was an element of Lee and Kirby and other people trying to kind of dip their toes into the water because they wanted to eventually write regular characters of color or of other backgrounds, or is it just it's not even occurring to them? They just want to add this character for, as you say, to teach the white characters an important lesson.
Honestly, I genuinely don't know, and it's another one of those things that is like sort of a shrouded in myth, like that.
Right.
If you could ask them today, what they said now reflect how they felt then, which again, I don't mean to question their hearts. Yeah. It's just hard to remember what you were doing 60 years ago. I can't remember what I was doing 6 days ago.
I think and I think the word used before about mythology makes a lot of sense. Clearly Lee and Kirby cared a lot about justice and cared a lot about their comics being a voice for that. We're going to get into that a lot more when we start talking about the X-Men and things like that. But I'm also sure that, there's commercial pressures. There's all this thing. And I think this is true of any media that moves these things along. We can look back and say, oh, that was just this incredible feminist work or, work on racial justice or things like that. And there probably was an intention of that. There probably was also a reason why people thought they could make a buck doing that at the time, And I think you're right that the memory of it is probably always going to be a little through rose-colored glasses.
Yeah, and like again, I do think that like it's very clear in their work and in the statements that they made, both later in life and at the time, that it was important to them to tell stories about social justice, like I said, and to tell stories that were against bigotry, and especially because they knew that their audience was young people. But how much of that was at play when they wrote this and drew this one particular issue of the Fantastic Four, that I don't know, and there may actually be research on that. I'm sure that there is much more in-depth research on that.
Right.
It's just I don't have. Unfortunately, I wish I had a pithy answer, but I don't.
One, by the way, a correction I want to make. That looking back over my notes, I realized the character who really comes out of the blaxploitation era is more Luke Cage. I think that some of that is Black Panther there. So that's a mistake I made. Wanted to make sure to correct. And again, there's some great writers we'll try to link to who've done a lot more about this. And again, it's from a perspective they can better talk to it than I can. But one thing I also just want to add is that just as part of what you're saying here, that clearly it's baked in, the Stan soapbox column, where Stan is making very clear statements about racial justice and about, why he's writing these things in his comic books. Talk a little about that, because that's a recurring thing in the comics themselves, right?
Well, Stan's soapbox was, I don't know that he'd always necessarily, just jumped into talking about bigotry.
Mm-hmm.
But he did run an editorial in 1968, so a bit later than what we're talking. I mean, Black Panther showed up in 66. 68 is not that much later, but the late 60s you really start to see the comic book industry more overtly responding to things like the civil rights movement and anti-war protests. Mm-hmm. So he wrote this editorial in 68, and Marvel reprinted it a lot lately. I guess they thought it was relevant. Mm-hmm. And Marvel, I mean, look, the Marvel, I don't even remember his title, but CEO or whatever, Ike Perlmutter, is very much in bed with Trump. Like, they have some skeletons in their closet, mm-hmm. but I do appreciate this editorial. Stan Lee had nothing to do with Ike Perlmutter.
Right.
Anyway, basically, what I can just read it. He says, "Let's lay it right on the line. Bigotry and racism are among the deadliest social ills plaguing the world today. But unlike a team of costume supervillains, they can't be halted with a punch in the snoot or a zap from a ray gun. The only way to destroy them is to expose them, to reveal them for the insidious evils they really are. The bigot is an unreasoning hater, one who hates blindly, fanatically, indiscriminately. If his hang-up is black men, he hates all black men. If a redhead once offended him, he hates all redheads. If some foreigner beat him to a job, he's down on all foreigners. He hates people he's never seen, people he's never known, with equal intensity, with equal venom. Now, we're not trying to say it's unreasonable for one human being to bug another. But although anyone has the right to dislike another individual, it's totally irrational, patently insane to condemn an entire race, to despise an entire nation, to vilify an entire religion. Sooner or later, we must learn to judge each other on our own merits. Sooner or later, if man is ever to be worthy of his destiny, we must fill our hearts with tolerance. For then, and only then, will we be truly worthy of the concept that man was created in the image of God, a God who calls us all his children."
Yeah. And that's, I think, the most famous one. There's definitely some other ones. There's one that I just want to read a couple quick lines of, because it's an issue that people bring up all the time today, where he says, talking about how there are people who, quote, "take great pains to point out that comics are supposed to be escapist reading and nothing more. But somehow I can't see that way. It seems to me that a story without a message, however subliminal, is like a man without a soul. Even the most escapist literature of all, old-time fairy tales, contained moral and philosophical points of view." And then it goes on to later say, "None of us lives in a vacuum. None of us is untouched by the everyday events around us, events which shape our stories just as they shape our lives. Our tales can be called escapist, but just because something's for fun doesn't mean we have to blanket our brains while we read it." And so to me, I love that one as well, because the first one you write is such a great statement of that. He's very clearly taking and Marvel Comics is taking a stance on the issues of the day in that regard. Personally, as a redhead, I'm very glad he calls out the anti-ginger bias in the world. I'm kidding, obviously. But also I love that he, today we again and again hear this idea of, why can't comic books just be good escapist fun? Why are we putting all these politics into them now? I love that Stan Lee is saying very clearly in the books themselves that he's being very intentional about these messages, and that he wants them to reflect the stories of the day in terms of civil rights, war and peace, youth rebellion, etc.
I feel like that's a really good segue to X-Men.
Yeah, let's start talking about the X-Men, because I'm glad that we talked about some of the others first, because I think X-Men is the only one, but clearly when you think about political comics in the 60s and Stan Lee, X-Men's what comes to mind. So tell us about the X-Men and their origin and sort of how it plays into all this.
So the X-Men, it's a team book right away. The original lineup is Cyclops, Marvel Girl, who is better known as Jean Grey, Iceman, Angel, and Beast. So
no Wolverine to start with.
Oh, no. Wolverine, he first shows up as a Hulk villain.
Wow.
Yeah, which is always so wild to me. Because it's not where you would expect to find him. I want to say that is in the late 70s, but I'm checking right now because of magic of Google.
Mm-hmm.
Not the late 70s. It was 74.
Okay.
So I had the decade right.
But still, long past war starting. So back to the X-Men themselves.
Right, and he does not become a member of the X-Men until the sort of revival of the X-Men under Chris Claremont, which is also in the 70s. But when we're talking about the Silver Age, it is 4 identical white guys and a girl. I mean, okay, Angel has wings and Beast has big hands and feet. Like, he wasn't even a furry blue guy then. He just had big hands and feet. But they are led by Professor X, Charles Xavier, who is a telepath in a wheelchair. And
quick question I want to interject in, because it's an issue, obviously, that matters a lot to me. Is Professor X the first time we have a notably disabled character appear? Well, I guess Daredevil had come up before, but that one's less, forgive the pun, less visible. Not an intentional pun. But is Professor X the first time we have a character in a wheelchair who's a regular ongoing hero?
Well, actually, the X-Men predate Daredevil by a few months.
Oh, okay.
So that's actually, you have opened a can of worms here, called the Doom Patrol. So just as a sidebar, and then we can kind of get back into X-Men. But so X-Men #1 came out in September 1963. And the whole idea is that they are mutants and they're considered freaks by society, which, again, it's like 2 guys and a girl who look absolutely completely normal, except Scott has to wear red sunglasses, and then a guy with big hands and feet and a guy with wings that he can hide under his jacket. But they're like, society hates us. Right. And it's like, okay, fine. A few months earlier, in June of 1963, DC published a comic they introduced a new team called the Doom Patrol. This is a team made up of quote-unquote freaks and outcasts, led by a genius in a wheelchair.
Wow, okay.
Who is also a professor. Or a doctor.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's this really weird synergy of these two teams that are very much defined by being outcasts from society, being shunned, considering themselves freaks. And like the Doom Patrol, none of them were born that way. They all had accidents and various wacky things gave them their powers.
Right.
But they are very much similarly portrayed as, you know, the powers are a burden as well as a blessing, and they are led by this mastermind who is in a wheelchair. And the thing is, they publish so close to each other, June and September. The lead time in comics, like, you can't publish a comic, you can't read a comic in June and have a copy of it on the stands in September. Right. It's just not possible. So the fact that they are so similar, like, literally the X-Men fight the Brotherhood of Evil Mutants and the Doom Patrol fights the Brotherhood of Evil.
Wow.
They're just not mutants. Like, it's so, and so some people have questioned, like, was there some plagiarism going on? How could there have been plagiarism going on? One of the creators of the Doom Patrol once said, oh yeah, first he said, no, it wasn't possible. And then he was like, no, Stan Lee totally copied me on purpose. And then he was like, I probably didn't.
I'm going to love the idea that there are 2 junior interns who are best friends or partners or something like that, who are just getting together to have coffee and be like, okay, what are you guys working on? What are we working on? Cool, let's share ideas and, like, inspire our bosses.
I mean, it's absolutely possible. Somebody could have seen pages from somebody else somewhere. Right. Like, that's totally within the realm of possibility. But it's also interesting because the Doom Patrol is very much the most Marvel-like of DC's comics at the time. Again, because these are characters who are, like, we are outcast from society and we hate having our powers and we feel like freaks,
Right.
and they fought with each other all the time. Like, it reads like a Marvel book that DC just happened to publish. It's wonderful. I love the early Doom Patrol. But to go back to Marvel, so you don't rightfully make fun of me again for always running off to DC. Yeah, so we have the X-Men, who protect a world that hates and fears them. I think it's very, very crucial that these characters, unlike any of the other ones that we're talking about here, except I guess theoretically Black Panther, because he was born to be a king, they're born that way. Right. You know, it's ingrained in them that they are mutants. Like, it's in their DNA. They didn't have an accident. They didn't go into space. They didn't, build something or train or have a traumatic experience. I mean, they've had many traumatic experiences, but this is...
Right. This is just part of who they are. This is part of how they were created, which, I think that seems very intentional and a very important part of who they are.
Yeah. And I mean, the other thing about, the X-Men, as well as the vast majority of these characters, the Fantastic Four, the Hulk, Spider-Man, Daredevil, all these characters get their powers from radiation. And in these early issues of X-Men, there's this idea that mutants are now coming into existence because of radiation, because we've split the atom, right, which is now a thing that the comics have completely done away with. And there are many mutants who are much older than that, like Wolverine. But these are all... There is an idea of intolerance and marginalization happening with the X-Men, but it also comes into that larger umbrella of atomic fears, right, that is very, very prevalent in the 60s.
I was talking before about how you can easily tell often what generation a particular work of art was created based on some of those things. I think one of them is definitely the origin story. What's the thing that people of that generation are most both fascinated by and afraid of? It's probably the thing that that later it's DNA science or, whatever it is, or today it's, or our version of it. I think it's another fascinating thing to look at. Like, it keeps evolving generation to generation.
Oh yeah, and you can absolutely trace this with, like, I like to look at, the chemicals that splash in Matt Murdock's face and give him his power, blind him and give him his powers. That changes every time they tell it, and it's always whatever we happen to be most afraid of. But you can also very easily trace it with the spider that bites Peter Parker. Right.
Yeah, no, I remember in Spider-Verse, it's like a genetically, it becomes like, it's like genetically modified spiders or whatever it is, instead of radiated spiders.
Yeah, it's like a GMO. It's like eating a tomato out of season.
Yeah, exactly. So let's talk about what is it that makes, it seems again here that with the X-Men, this is the perfect time and place for them to come about, and again, it's that chicken and egg thing. This is the time when the beatnik age has been going for a long time. We're starting to move into the hippie age. The idea of there being people who really identify themselves as counterculture and as looked down upon seems very much a part of this. As well as with civil rights, we're talking a lot about why it's wrong to hate people because of something they're born with. And I'm guessing that had to be very intentional of creating people who are, as you said, like the Fantastic Four are weird, they're different, but they're beloved. Here, the X-Men are despised, they're hated because of how they're born. That's a very intentional choice, it seems.
Yeah, and I don't know that all these things were a lot of these things were sort of created in a vacuum. Like, some of these characters are supporting characters to pre-existing ones. Black Panther shows up in an issue of Fantastic Four. Black Widow shows up in an Iron Man story, etc. But for the most part, they weren't necessarily approaching it as a holistic universe. Right. But I do think it's very telling still that if you live in the Marvel universe and you have superpowers, if you got them because you fell into a vat of something or you went into space on the wrong day, you're good. it's all good. Everybody loves you. But if you were born with them, all of a sudden you're a monster and everybody hates you.
Right.
I do think there's a certain amount of rational irrationality to it, like, because it's the thing you can't control.
Right.
Like, well, I just won't go into space. But you can't do anything about your genes, but I'm probably tthinking about it harder than any of the faceless bigots in random Marvel comics have ever thought about it.
Very true, very true.
But yeah, I mean, and I feel bad because we're overlooking Spider-Man so much, and he already gets enough of that. That old Parker luck. Like, Spider-Man is very, very important, and he is a very important character in particular for that idea of being a preteen or a teen and feeling alienated and ostracized, and like nothing ever goes right for you.
This is a non-DC related tangent you want to go on, so I'm going to totally encourage it. So let's put a pin in the X-Men. Let's talk about Peter Parker.
Well, no, I just wanted to like acknowledge that like the X-Men are not the only characters like this. The Hulk as well. They are very much, they are very much metaphors for feeling like you don't fit in and feeling like nobody sees the real you. And having these, especially the Hulk, obviously having these big feelings that you don't know what to do with and they're going to explode. Right. And like, there is a reason that Spider-Man was a hit right away and remains one of the 3 most important superheroes and most famous and beloved superheroes in the world. And it is because he appeals so deeply on that level. But yeah, I just wanted to give him his due because
for sure.
He gets pushed around enough. And you mentioned Spider-Verse. Spider-Verse updates that in such a beautiful and perfect way, and just brings that idea of how relatable the character is supposed to be into the new millennium. And it's a perfect movie, and everybody should watch it.
It is one of my absolute favorite comic book movies. If for nothing else, I'm a dirty casual. We've talked about this a lot. This is why I'm so glad I have you as a resource. I don't know. I have trouble reading comic books. My brain is not very good at the visual art kind of formats. And generally, like, animated stuff is hard for me to understand in the same way. I've never seen a movie be so in love with the fact that it's based on a comic book and be so very clearly trying to bring the pages of a comic book to life the way Spider-Verse does.
Yeah.
As well as the fact that you and I talked about this offline. It's the first time I think that we've officially seen that at least one version of Peter Parker is explicitly canonically Jewish, which I love.
Yes. Yes. He has been coded as Jewish for a very, very, very long time. But yeah, Peter B. Parker has a Jewish wedding. Yeah. He steps on a glass at the ceremony, and I felt a lot of feelings about it.
Me too. Me too. And I think that also Peter Parker seems to represent what you were talking about before. Like, I don't know if an 8-year-old cares about the struggles of a kid in high school. But that a 14-year-old absolutely would be, even maybe a 12 or a 13-year-old. Like, Spider-Man Peter Parker seems very much a character written for a slightly older audience.
Yeah, absolutely. You graduate from Superman to Spider-Man.
And am I also right in saying that, and tell me if I'm wrong here, but my impression is, like, Reed Richards had a pretty good life before the stuff happened to him. Same with Ben and things like that. Peter Parker's a kid who was already kind of the nerdy kid who gets pushed around by the school bullies before the spider bit him. And it's not that he is ostracized and awkward because of being Spider-Man, but he's now doubly so.
Yeah, well, he's also an orphan, and they have money troubles. Like, he's got a bunch of problems going on. And being Spider-Man doesn't actually fix any of them. Like, he's still picked on at school. He makes some money off of it. He takes the photos of himself, right. But his problems are compounded by being Spider-Man rather than solved by them. But it also gives him, behind the mask, he has the freedom to say what he wants, and like there's a very palpable physical and verbal freedom to being Spider-Man, because
he's sassy.
he's sassy. You can jump all over the place and mouth off to bullies and back it up. Like, what could be more fun than being Spider-Man? And what could suck more than being Peter Parker? And that's the magic of it. Oh, I love him.
He's definitely a fantastic character, and I'm glad that he is one, it seems, that has crossed over so well from some of his on-screen appearances to now being an essential part of the MCU, to being a part of the Spider-Verse, and we'll see where all that's going to go. So pulling us back to the X-Men, though, I think one of the things that people most talk about, and that has again been somewhat, there's obviously some real truth to it, but there's also, it's been mythologized and changed, is this idea that Professor X and Magneto represent, like, if they're both representatives of an oppressed group, that the two of them represent very different approaches to oppression. And I think today that many people now, we sort of read a lot of it back into that and say that they're supposed to be stand-ins for Martin Luther King and Malcolm X and things like that. And then a lot of that has been sort of added over time. Talk to us about where it starts, because I think a lot of people may not understand that while there's obviously elements of that, the origins is not quite what people often think.
Well, first of all, I just think it's funny that we're actually recording this on Martin Luther King Jr. Day. So
very much very important.
Fitting. But yeah, I mean, people tend to boil that conflict down, the conflict between Professor X and Magneto down to that specific divide. And it's overly simplistic in many ways. It's overly simplistic, obviously, when you're talking about the actual civil rights movement. And I think it pulls from a really sanitized version of Martin Luther King that only really looks at the things that he said that today we do not find challenging.
Right. The things that he said that white America finds the easiest to swallow.
Right. It's the I have a dream speech, but it's not letter from Birmingham jail.
Right. That's a really good way of putting it.
And so I think it does a disservice to both of these real men to bottle it down to that. And it also is not particularly accurate for the comic book characters. It's certainly not something that was intentional at the time that they were created. When they were created, I mean, I mentioned before, Magneto leads the Brotherhood of Evil Mutants. He was not created as a nuanced supervillain. He was a fellow mutant, but he believed in mutant supremacy. It wasn't a case of we need to fight or we will be destroyed. It was a case of we're just better, so I'm going to kill all the humans. And he was a cackling supervillain, and he had layers, and he had a goofy hat, and he's so much fun. Like, he was a great supervillain right from the get-go because he was larger than life and really entertaining. But all the nuance of his approach, and even that came later, and even the idea of him being a Holocaust survivor was not a thing until I think the early 80s. Right. So, and also, like as we were discussing this before we recorded, I did a little bit of research into it, and there's some really interesting quotes from Chris Claremont about this, who wrote the X-Men for like basically all the 70s and 80s, where he was responding to the idea that the characters are meant to be MLK and Malcolm X. He was like, oh no, like when I was writing in the 70s, it was way too close to the 60s, and like there was no lens of history to look back at that through. It was just recent assassinations, and it would have been really disrespectful of me as a white man to even attempt that.
Yeah, I think that's such an important point, and you again have to remember all the ways in which these different stories are mythologized and changed, and that we today have a very mythologized view of both Martin Luther King and Malcolm X, but then also that at the time it was almost going the other way, and that sort of one of the things that I've gotten the more I've dug into this is that clearly they weren't trying to just write about these two characters, but that conversations about, assimilation versus separation and, peaceful resistance versus fighting back were very much a part of the cultural context. And that, but in a way, that to two, fairly liberal Jewish men from New York, Malcolm X would not have been seen in any heroic way, probably. That the media at that time was still writing about him in incredibly negative ways. And I don't think for a moment that they were thinking about Malcolm X specifically as sort of a stand-in for Magneto. But I know that at that time there was a lot of discussion about, any hint of black pride being seen as like kind of the same way today people get offended at, Black Lives Matter and say, it should be all lives matter instead. You'd have people take the Black Pride movement and start talking about it in terms of like, does it mean that, white people are bad, stuff like that. And so when you have these two different groups that are talking about how they fight oppression, the bad guys being the ones who are like, no, we're better, there's got to be elements of that cultural conversations playing in. But yeah, I think the idea that therefore it's Martin Luther King and Malcolm X is just incredibly simplistic, both for the comic books and for the history itself.
Yeah, and quite frankly, Magneto could not have been depicted as a nuanced or sympathetic villain in the 60s because that was literally forbidden by the comics code. Villains had to be either completely evil or completely redeemed by the end of the story. I made a big mistake. I'm so sorry, Thor. Please take me in. There was no gray area. It literally was not allowed. The comics would not have been given the seal to be published with. And so Magneto is this very outlandish, scenery-chewing villain, which he's still very outlandish and loves snacking down on scenery, and that's why he's so great.
But that today we see him in a much more sympathetic light. We understand his point of view, and he's him and Killmonger are often connected in that kind of way of the different approaches to fighting oppression and things like that. And from what you're saying, it sounds like none of that is in the original.
No. Again, he's a very fun character. And like you were saying, that the sort of seeds of that debate between assimilation and what we might phrase as resistance now, but at the time might be better described. Magneto's behavior would be better described as supremacy. That's definitely in there. But we're talking about two guys who changed their names to sound less Jewish. So yeah, they're gonna be on board with the assimilation train to a large extent. I would guess. Again, we can't really say how they felt about assimilating, how they felt about their own culture, which was also much more. These were men who lived in New York, and that's where their culture was. Right. So it was still a diaspora, but not as scattered and global as we might think of it today. And we can't really say how they would have felt about Malcolm X unless there's a quote from one of them about him, which there probably isn't.
Right. Yeah, and it's fun to think about, is this the Magneto they intended, or did they want to write him as a more sympathetic character but couldn't because of the comics code? But all that's just conjecture. We don't have any idea. We just have what's on the page.
Yeah, and they wrote X-Men for, and drew. They created X-Men for the Silver Age, but a lot of what we think of as who the X-Men are and how they work is very much a Chris Claremont creation of later decades. The Silver Age X-Men is a very different animal in the same way that, he's a more minor character, but the Silver Age Daredevil is very, very different from what he would become in the 80s, which is what we see in, the TV show.
That makes a lot of sense. And I think that of course these characters are going to evolve, and of course we're going to read back into them what we want. One thing I wonder about, I don't know if you would know about this or if any of our listeners do, one thing I think has definitely happened a lot in media is a character is written as a villain, and the writer thinks of them as a villain. But for whatever reason, audiences wind up identifying with them far more than may have been intended. Like the queer coding of Disney villains, I think, is a great example of this, but it happens in lots of other places. And I do wonder if on some level there was some sense of, you know, people from whatever their background or whatever the movements they're part of, who do sort of read Professor X and think, okay, but maybe this Magneto guy has a point, even though he's written ridiculously, you know, and that there starts to be some of that, like, the writer didn't intend to be sympathetic, but people are finding some sympathy in him. And, you know, again, it's chicken and the egg, and who the heck knows where it starts. But I wonder sort of how that plays in all this, because, I mean, today I think of Magneto as probably in the top 3, if not the number 1, most sympathetic villains that I know of. You know, where he's the closest to, in a lot of ways, I think he's a lot more right than Professor X, even if sometimes I disagree with his methods or things like that. But that sounds wildly different than where the character started.
Oh, yeah, for sure. And it's also, I mean, it's wildly different from where both of them started, because Professor X, over the decades, has done a lot of really sketchy-ass things, which cause us to lose a lot of sympathy for him. Like, he's faked his death like 100 times. He manipulates people, which is easy to do when you're a telepath. Like there's a lot of, you know, they've pulled a lot of skeletons out of that closet. It's like when you start with these two characters where one is a paragon of good and one is a paragon of evil, I think that's an oxymoron, but you know what I mean? One represents good and one represents evil. And then you start to unpack them and pull skeletons out of the closet. The good one's only going to have bad skeletons, because it can't be like, oh, one time he saved a puppy. Like, okay, surprise. And the bad one's only going to have, if not necessarily good things, and we do find out about, like, genuinely good things that Magneto has done in his life, but also sympathetic things. But so it's partially that, like, as the comics have gone on, more and more stories have been told that show Professor X in not so great a light. But there's also the fact that at the time, the fact that he was an authoritative white man was enough to be like, he's right and good. And it's sort of like what we've talked about in the past of the way that, like, superheroes would gaslight their girlfriends all the time during this era. But it was never depicted as a flaw because, of course, they had every right to do that. They had to maintain their secret identity. And even though he is a mutant, he still is working along these axes of privilege that allow him to get away with behavior that nowadays we're like, dude, what the hell?
This was the age when psychological hospitals were supposed to, you know, fix people, and lobotomies were a perfectly good part of that, and you know, other things like that. And so having a character who, like Professor X, who very early on is using mind control to fix the mind of someone who is, you know, a criminal or something like that, or has a different ideas than he does, that seems heroic and great. And then today we're like, oh my God, that's awful.
Yeah, I mean, there's even, I think it's the first issue, he has a passing thought about how he's secretly in love with Jean, who is a teenager under his care. And that was very quickly dropped because what the hell? Yeah. But that's a thing that, you know, at the time, like, they threw that in there, like, well, I say they, but we don't know where that came from, because a lot of if you look at a lot of the Lee and Kirby collaborations without the words, they become, I don't know that I want to say more feminist, but they become less chauvinistic. There's a wonderful blog called Kirby Without Words that literally takes the words off and will sometimes, you know, dig in, like where the person who runs it can post Kirby's original pencils where he would, like, write in the margins what he thought the characters might be saying.
Oh, interesting.
And then, and so Lee would either keep that or adjust it, or he'd come up with something else entirely. And so you'll literally have panels, a lot of this is Fantastic Four stuff, but you'll literally have panels where, like, Sue is using her powers, and it's just a panel of Sue using her powers, but then as Kirby drew it, but then Lee will add a speech bubble from the side that's Reed going, "That's it, keep it up, blast him."
Oh, interesting.
Like she needs help. And so I do wonder, like, creepy throwaway lines like Professor X is about Jean. I feel like that's probably more of a Stan line than a Jack one.
No, that makes sense. And I mean, even we've talked about in prior episodes and a bit in the last episode, the incredible misogyny of the marriage-obsessed Lois Lane always chasing after Clark Kent, and that just the action of it being Peter Parker, pining over the girl, that's a big step forward, but clearly there's still a lot of ways to go.
Yeah, there's still a lot of chauvinism at play, but I'll just say that when Jack Kirby did create a character who was based on his wife, she was 6'5", and her name was Big Barda, and she literally just picks her husband up and throws him over her shoulder whenever she wants, and he's super into it. So
that
Jack liked a strong woman.
Good for them. Good for them. One quick follow-up question on that, and then I want to say something more about Professor X, and then we can move on. Obviously, a theme that I know we've talked about, and that you've done some great writing on your blog, is about the way women superheroes are portrayed, particularly in terms of their outfits and the degree to which, in terms of their outfits and the way that their bodies react to gravity, for example, and an incredible sexualized manner of some of these characters. What's happening with that in the Silver Age? Are we still getting a lot of boob armor and, busts that have never seen gravity before and things like that? Or are we having less sexualized, more realistic depiction of women characters?
Oh, it was very tame because of the Comics Code.
Right.
Yeah, so they couldn't really depict super duper sexy outfits, or really, like, the Comics Code is literally like, don't go crazy with the boobs, like, make them normal, guys. And I should caveat that normal has a very, very wide range.
Of
but
course.
I think you know what I mean in terms of eye candy and not showing a diversity of body types.
The Barbie level, this human being would literally fall over. We're not quite at that level anymore.
No, that was part of what spurred the Comics Code, that comics were getting so visibly lecherous, and that is pulled way the hell back for decades. It's really in the 70s that we start to see sexier outfits coming in, or even the late 60s. And sexier outfits, sexier poses, sexier angles. There's a lot of more butt shots, which is also in part because they're experimenting with where to sort of quote unquote put the camera. But yeah, at this time, it's very tame. And also, like, a lot of these artists are very well trained draftsmen, which you don't always get in modern comics. Kirby was not he was not a beautiful artist. He's an incredible artist. His work is groundbreaking and astonishing, and, like, some of the stuff that he did, like, he played around with photography in his work. Like, you have these cosmic scenes in Fantastic Four where, like, the characters are drawn over photographs, and he does collages, and it's just amazing. But in terms of the human figures that he's drawing, they're all kind of ugly. They don't look great.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, so nobody's like, who's hot? Jack Kirby's Sue Storm.
I can see that. I do want to say one other thing about Professor X, because I think we run him down some, and I'm a big believer in that. One of the very first episodes of Superhero Ethics was talking about all the ethical problems with Professor X. I do want to say, and this is one that is dear to my own heart as a disabled person, having that character in the wheelchair is something that is a very important seminal moment as well for disability issues. I've worked for a long time in disability politics. I even did that before I lost my leg. And if you go back and read some of the first stuff about, disability awareness and disability rights, and even just like stuff that was like being given to soldiers coming home from Vietnam who are now in wheelchairs, like people were giving them Professor X-Men comics as a way of like, look, here's a hero in a wheelchair. He features very prominently in a lot of the literature and the sort of being referenced. And for me, it's particularly important because something I've talked about that is very rarely seen is what we often see if we have a disabled character in science fiction or fantasy or comic books or whatever it is that the magic or the science or the radiation or whatever it is cures their disability. And so that their power comes from, Matt Murdock is blind, but really through his like echolocation, whatever it is, he can basically perceive the world around him even better than most, seeing people could. And, all these other characters who like, through their powers are able to suddenly move so much better than anybody else. The fact that Professor X does everything he does while still in a wheelchair, and that's entirely the power of his mind, and he's not disabled, he's not powerful because of his disability, and we can talk about how later movies would play with that in kind of really gross ways, but also he doesn't have to overcome his disability. He just is a disabled person who's also a superhero, is something I think that was, I don't know how groundbreaking it was, but it was incredibly important and still has a lot of relevance today.
No, I think it's super important. I can't think of, I'm going to be mad when I inevitably come up with another character. Oh, Dr. Midnight. Dr. Midnight is a Golden Age DC character who is very much in the Daredevil line of character. He's a blind character, but his powers allow him to see under certain conditions. Yeah. So,
there are versions of Oracle and Barbara Gordon that do some good versions of that, but then they also take that in some pretty terrible ways in different writings and things like that. But yeah,
yeah, and of course that's much later. Like I can't think of a major character who predates Professor X, who is besides Dr. Midnight, who's pretty obscure, who is A, a disabled superhero at all, but B, as you said, a disabled superhero whose superpower doesn't mitigate their disability. But I can think of a lot of instances of like the trope of the evil disabled character. So it's also, Professor X is also super important because he's not that. Like, again, we did dunk on him for like 10 minutes and he's done some shit,
so,
but like,
and
he's a hero and he was presented unquestionably as a hero when he was introduced.
And just for anybody who also just really kind of connect the dots about why that matters so much, the problem is that most of the time in media, disability is presented as a problem to be cured. And so that a disabled person is, and I'm using awful terms and I'm saying them intentionally, but that a disabled person is like broken or needs to be fixed or whatever it is or something like that. And that a lot of the disability rights movement, disability pride movement has really been about like, no, we are different. I hate the term differently abled, and many people do as well. But that concept of, this is difference, it is not brokenness, and not every disabled person is yearning for the cure, to be fixed. And so that when all the media is about, wouldn't it be great if science or magic or whatever it is could allow you to be cured, it just feeds into this very awful narrative that Professor X breaks. So just wanted to kind of make that point. And, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, I've seen, I saw a really interesting discussion on Tumblr, so unfortunately I cannot source it because it was just a bunch of people I don't know talking about it. But basically making the case, and this case has been made a few places. I want to say that the podcast, Jay and Miles Explain the X-Men, has made it multiple times. But actually, I know that they have, but that, we sort of touched on the idea of the mutant metaphor as a metaphor for any marginalized group, and we linked it to the civil rights movement at the time. And people often read early X-Men as a metaphor for race, and in the early 2000s, it was often read as a metaphor for queerness, especially, there's that scene in the second X-Men movie where Bobby's parents are like, have you tried not being a mutant?
Conversion therapy, which, nonsense like that.
Right. With, a gay director. Like, it's not subtle. And all of those analogies have their place, but none of them are perfect fits. And there is no perfect fit because it's a fantasy. But I have seen people argue that disability is the best metaphor. And this conversation was sparked by the scene in the third X-Men movie where Rogue comes in all excited and says, I just heard there's a cure. Is that true? And Storm says, we don't need to be cured because there's nothing wrong with us. But Storm and Rogue have very different experiences of being a mutant, where Storm is a goddess, has been worshipped as a goddess, and has no drawbacks to her power whatsoever, and Rogue can never touch another human being. And the discussion went on to sort of talk about how, disability is such a wide umbrella, and it covers so many different things that, somebody with chronic pain might feel very differently about certain issues than someone with hearing loss.
Right. No, that's a great point. It's one I hadn't thought of that terms, but one thing that just occurs to me there that you could go so deep on is just the idea that in this disability community, there's often, I'm talking broad generalizations here, but there's often a real split between people who are born with disabilities versus those who develop disabilities at some point in life. And I'm in the second category. I lost my leg in an accident in my adulthood. Very different than someone who's born someone who's born with a different kind of limb or without a limb or something like that. And that applies for all disabilities, which to me is an interesting take on what we were saying before about how the X-Men are born with their issues rather than the Fantastic Four or something like that who have that happen to them. So just another great parallel. And I think it's kind of a nice way to kind of wrap up our discussion about the X-Men, because to me, I think one of the reasons why I love these characters so much and why I think they're so beloved and have been so successful generation after generation is that it's written in a way that you can read civil rights onto them. You can read queer rights onto them. You can read disability rights onto them, because they're really speaking about a lot of, pretty essential truths about a lot of these things. And it's not just to praise them. I mean, if they're supposed to be a metaphor for race, the fact that they're all white is certainly a big problem from the beginning. Mm-hmm. There's lots of issues like that. I'm glad you mentioned the Explaining the X-Men podcast. A lot of my concepts on this were shaped by it. I was planning to mention them as well, and we'll link to them in the show notes. And they do a great job of pointing out that early on, Jean Grey, like all of them have deep, interesting personalities, and Jean Grey's personality is she's the girl. And that she's often seen like doing the dishes at like really we're not fully liberated here yet by any means. But even with all that, the fact that the X-Men can continually be seen as like metaphors for these major issues in our society about assimilation and justice and fighting oppression and things like that it really to me is a great statement about like just how powerful that story is.
Yeah, and I think that this to bring it back to this sort of overall topic, it really does explain why all of these characters are so enduring. They, the X-Men speak to these important questions about bigotry and marginalization and acceptance and feeling othered. And Spider-Man speaks to insecurity and alienation, and the Hulk absolutely speaks to alienation and anger and loss of control. All of these, the reason these characters were successful, they weren't flash in the pan characters like Lee and Kirby and Ditko and all the other people who were involved in their creations. Were really tapping into something that is very deeply relatable in the same way, again, that sort of Marvel stock in trade in the same way that DC taps into, we want to believe a man can fly, and we want to see someone and read about someone who knows what it's like to feel like a loser. Right. We want both of those things, and that's why these characters endure.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point. And I think there's a lot of discussion now about with the X-Men returning to Marvel, if they'll appear in the MCU. And there's been a lot of discussion about who that should be and how they're going to be cast and things like that. one of the discussions that I'm seeing going forward that I think could be really interesting, could be really awful if it's done badly, but if done right, could be really interesting, is that if you start by the idea of the X-Men existing in the modern day, you really can't have Eric be a Jewish person in the Holocaust anymore because he would just be too old. And so one version I've seen being floated is the idea of that maybe we're going to race flip the characters and make them forget about them being metaphors, that the horrors that he goes through is racism in the American South, or perhaps that he's South African and he's born during apartheid or whatever it is. And to me, I love ideas like that. Again, they can be done very badly. They have to be done very, really don't have white writers for them, please, if you go that direction. But just the idea that, the Holocaust obviously is a unique moment in history, and comparing it to anything else can be very problematic. But the idea that Eric has had this incredibly traumatic moment of the utter brutality and evil of oppression in a way that someone else who's like him hasn't had in Professor X, I like the idea that you could translate that to other moments in history and other times.
Yeah, sadly, the Holocaust was a unique moment, but it did not spring from a unique pattern of human behavior. I
really like that way of phrasing it.
I just finished reading the book Caste, Caste, by Isabel Wilkerson, which is amazing and very, very intense. But it talks about the caste systems in the U.S., which is a racial caste system, and in India, and in Nazi Germany, and
interesting.
It draws parallels between them. And one thing that it talks about at length is that the Nazis based a lot of what they did on the American South.
Yeah, that doesn't surprise me, unfortunately.
So yeah, I'm sort of two minds about, like, there are legitimately so few Jewish characters in comics.
Yeah,
like,
that's
vanishingly few, and they are actively being erased. Like, Harley Quinn was Jewish, but her show makes anti-Semitic jokes, and the character all of a sudden became only half Jewish, and like there's like a half a dozen, and so I am torn between not wanting to lose that, but obviously the reality of, you're right, he would be too old, and also there are other very important stories that still really, really need to be told, and other voices that need to be heard, and that need to be heard in the mouth of a prominent character. Right. So it's a complicated question.
For sure. And certainly, as awful as the Holocaust is, it's not the only moment of horrific anti-Semitism. You could still have Eric be Jewish, experience anti-Semitism at a different moment in history. And again, as a white person who is only half Jewish myself, I'm not the one to arbitrate that by any means. But I just love that these are the kind of conversations we can have, about saying, here are these archetypes. How can they be put in different moments in time? While also respecting that, like, the fact that they're set in one particular moment is very important when there isn't more of that. Thank you for bringing up that point on the other side of those questions as well. We've gone on for a long time. Is there anything else you kind of want to talk about in terms of Marvel and stuff like that? I want to just kind of quick touch on what's happening in TV at this moment before we wrap up, and a lot of that we can maybe hold to our next conversation. But anything else in terms of what Marvel is doing in the 60s and stuff like that?
I know. I think we wrung a lot of the juice out of that. I will say it's a huge topic. Literally, whole books have been written about this era. There are many biographies of both Lee and Kirby, and I'm sure there are biographies of Ditko and other figures from the era. There are books about each of these characters and their origins. So, like, we're skimming the surface. There's so much to say, but I think I've said all I have the expertise to try to weigh in on.
For sure. So, obviously, one of the other big moments in comic book history that happens in the 60s during this age is that Batman goes on television with, I don't think the first time, but Batman 66, the Adam West Batman, is certainly one of the most well-known and has a very big impact on how these things are thought of going forward. We'll probably save it more for the next episode, but you want to talk just a little bit about Batman 66 and what was going on there and the kind of the impact of it?
Yeah, so Batman, I don't know that he'd been on TV before this. He had been in movie serials. But yeah, he was he was definitely not as big of a seller as Superman or even, at this point in time, Lois Lane outsold Batman, which is a statistic I will never shut up about my entire life.
Never should.
And if I met Batman, I would say it to his face and laugh at him. The show sort of had the freedom to kind of be a bit goofy, and it revitalized the character. I say a bit goofy. It was extremely goofy. It revitalized the character and increased his prominence. The Batman TV show really steered into camp, which was an idea and an aesthetic that was becoming increasingly popular as the decade wore on. And you can see that spilling out. It definitely spills out into his comics. They were absolutely influenced by the show, and there's an interesting kind of give and take where, for example, the producers' ratings were falling after season 2, and so the show producers said, we want to add a girl, and they said to the comics people, come up with a girl character that we can put in the show, and that's why the Barbara Gordon version of Batgirl was created on demand by the producers of the TV show, even though she appeared in the comics first.
And I wish I could make fun of that being a thing of the 60s, but that's also literally the origin story of Seven of Nine in Star Trek, so that's something that happens in TV a lot.
Yeah. So that plot developments kind of went back and forth between the two mediums, but also the campiness bled into the comics, and so, just sort of a more, and this is true across the whole industry, more of a sort of psychedelic visual style. Some really creative. If
you want to kind of place it
visuals in
television history, watch an episode of Batman 66, and then watch an episode of the original series of Star Trek, because they're both that exact same, like, all primary colors, all sort of like greens and yellows and reds in bright amounts. I have no knowledge of art, so I'm not describing it well, but you really think like the artistic direction of the two shows is exactly the same, because it's very similar in those kind of regards, as well as with the campiness of it.
I do wonder how much of that was based on technology, like those were the colors that could show on those particular like cathode ray televisions, but I don't know enough about television history to speak to it.
I think that's part of it. I think that also just the 60s, like, art cultures going in that direction was part of it. But then again, like, is it because the 60s art culture is shaped by the television? Who knows,
Yeah. And the other thing about the Batman show is that it operates on two levels where, many people have spoken to this, but adults thought it was funny because it was campy, and children took it completely seriously. Right. They took it all at face value. They didn't realize that it was tongue-in-cheek, and they were like, wow, Batman and Robin are amazing heroes. Why are the grown-ups laughing?
I grew up on syndication of that, and I remember when Michael Keaton's Batman came out and people were talking about it's going to be this like darker version of Batman and not as silly. I was like, wait, that's silly? I guess so.
People were big mad about Michael Keaton's Batman because they were like, no, Batman's funny. What are you doing?
And this is hilarious to me because the whole idea of, we were talking about this before, about how if you grew up with one version of a character, you get locked into like, that's the true version. That's the right version. And I feel like this is true with probably many characters, but Batman has to be the one where there's been just the most incredible range. Like, I'd love to take someone who's never heard of Batman, probably have to be an alien from another planet or something, and just show them 2 or 3 episodes of Batman 66, and then show them Chris Nolan's The Dark Knight, and tell them this is the same character. Because you would never believe it. Like...
Yeah. I just want to say, you've made fun of me for bringing it back to DC, but in this episode about Marvel's Silver Age, you definitely brought up The Dark Knight.
Yep, I will. Batman is always and forever going to be my favorite superhero, even with all of his problems. I'm right now.
We have our things that we love.
I'm right now watching. Have you seen
fine.
Gotham by Gaslight?
Not the movie. I've read the comic.
The movie's really interesting and addresses one of the things that I know people critique often, which is that in the movie he is spending an awful lot of time using his money to address the social ills that cause crime and not just like beating up poor people, which I really, really like.
Mm-hmm.
But that's a whole other story. But yes, no, I'm a Chris Nolan stan. Except when he decided to hate on Occupy in the third movie, but I just, write that out of canon. Anyway, yes, now that we've both been called out, we've talked about everything from the 60s. I ended our first episode. This is a two-parter. I ended our first part at about 50 minutes, figuring we would, end up at about an hour and a half, an hour, 40 minutes. We're now well into 2 hours, 15 minutes. So clearly the second one's going to be a little bit longer. But I think it's a good point to wrap up. Any other kind of last comments or points you want to make, Jessica?
No, I think like I said, I think that these characters, as ridiculous and of their time as they are in so many ways, like I said, they really tap into very fundamental human emotions and concerns, and that's why we're still talking about them for over 2 hours, 60 years later.
Yeah, no, I'm so glad that we are, and I feel like there is sort of a, this is the time where they're moving from being kid stuff to maybe more teenager stuff. They're dealing with issues. I'm interested in the history of the early Superman, Batman, Wonder Woman. I'm not sure if I would have spent much time reading those as a kid or even today. This is really the point in the history where I really get on the train. So I'm so glad you, especially as our DC resident person, took the time to really help us see the Marvel side of it, as well as what's going on with DC. Because I think that's just knowing that DC had their own version of the X-Men for a little while is fascinating to me, in Doom Patrol. And we haven't even touched on Teen Titans, which we'll make sure to talk on the next episode with. So, Jessica, for people who are really loving what you have to say here, they want to hear more of your thoughts, either on other podcasts or writings, where can they find you?
Well, I'm on Twitter at Jess_Plummer, and I do most of my comics writing at bookriot.com, where I'm a contributing editor. And I also have a podcast called Flights and Tights, which covers Superman movies.
Yeah, and I really want to point out, I really want to hype up Jessica's both writings and podcasting. I've really learned a lot by a lot of the stuff Jessica's written. And I will say that as someone who grew up thinking that the Christopher Reeve Superman is the most super of Supermen, you crushed my little heart by telling me all the things that are wrong with those movies, but I have come to understand why you're saying it. For someone who either loves Superman or just wants to learn more about it, I think the Flights and Tights, the discussions you have are just fantastic. And I think today's Superman is not a character who gets a lot of attention. And so I also really love that you really bring back a lot of the reasons why people love Superman so much. And so I really want to give a recommendation to those as well. So thank you again, Jessica, for being a part of this. To you, the listener, what's your take on all we're talking about? Where do you agree with us? Where do you have different views of things? What are your favorite parts of the Silver Age comics history, or is this all totally new to you? Let us know. We love listener feedback. You can join conversations with us on Facebook or Twitter, or you can email us directly. All that can be found if you go to theethicalpanda.com. That's where I keep all the different podcasts I'm doing. Go there, you'll find all the contact information, or you can go to strandedpanda.com. This podcast is a proud member of the Stranded Panda podcast community, and there you can find all of my podcasts, as well as a lot of other great podcasts about DC, Marvel, Star Trek, Star Wars, lots of other great things. I'm currently doing a series with Ashley Coffin on The Stand, which is a really interesting take on the Stephen King novel. A lot of great stuff there to check out. Last thing I'd say is, if you like this podcast, if you want to help more people find the podcast, the best thing you can do is leave a review for us. When people are searching for things, the X-Men are being talked about. They want to search for something about X-Men. The more reviews we have, the higher we come up in the search engines, the more people will find us and things like that. And then last thing I want to say, just as I'm all in self-promotion, and somehow I never got a chance to bring this into the conversation. Just a few episodes ago, we actually did a whole conversation with J. Scotty St. Clair on Dr. Doom, who you and I never really got to talk about, Jessica, but is another interesting example of the villain who emerges in this time. He's the main villain of the Fantastic Four to get started, who very quickly becomes sympathetic in some ways as well. And in that episode, we talk about the way Doctor Doom kind of plays with the lines between villain or anti-hero or reluctant ally or whatever it is. So check all that out. Please check out all the great stuff Jessica's doing and other things going on in Stranded Panda, and have a great day.